I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves, but I'll just make a few introductory remarks about what the Blockchain Alliance is, and then we'll get going. As you all know, every new technology follows the same pattern once it's introduced. Criminals are the earliest adopters of it, if it's any good, and law enforcement plays catch-up, trying to learn how to use it and how to master it. In fact, I often say if criminals are not using your technology, there's probably something wrong with it, so you should go back to the lab. There are any number of examples of that phenomenon that I could rattle off, but perhaps the greatest example is the internet itself. Long before most of us knew what a .com was or what the web was, criminals, particularly child pornographers and other criminals, were exploiting the internet for criminal purposes. And in the mid-'90s, law enforcement turned to the industry, what was then the very embryonic internet industry, and asked for assistance in learning about the internet and how it worked, so they could learn to catch up with the criminals who were already a step ahead of them in using that technology. And no one would say that over the last 20 years we have done away with cybercrime, but that outreach by law enforcement to industry was a real turning point in the relationship, and it went a long way toward helping law enforcement not only reduce their anxiety about this new technology, but really learn to master it. In fact, in 1996, DOJ created the computer crime section, and the FBI created its first cyber investigative section, and within just a few years, prosecutors and agents were being trained to use the internet as an investigative tool. So within just a few short years, it went from being something that law enforcement was terrified of and viewed as an existential threat to public safety to being something that was actually a tool that could be to their advantage in conducting investigations. And the Blockchain Alliance is based on that same basic idea. It's designed or intended to help law enforcement get up the learning curve as quickly as possible so they can not only no longer be anxious about blockchain technology, but really learn to master it and to use it in investigations. And it also is a forum for open dialogue between industry and law enforcement to help develop a trusting relationship so that information can be shared about trends, technical issues, issues of concern on either side. And the goal is to help law enforcement get much better, much faster at going after criminals who use Bitcoin and the blockchain, because a safer, more secure blockchain is good for all of us. The critical difference from that internet model that I mentioned from 20 years ago is that in this case, industry reached out to law enforcement, not the other way around. And if you remember nothing else about the Blockchain Alliance, I hope you remember that I can't think of another industry, and I was a prosecutor for 15 years, where the industry reached out to law enforcement in this way and said, help us help you. And that's what's going on here. And it speaks volumes about the quality of the companies in this industry and the people at those companies, that they recognize that what's good for public safety is also good for industry, and they've taken the initiative to start this effort. So all the credit for the Blockchain Alliance goes to the members of industry who founded it and to the leading founders, Coin Center and the Digital Chamber, and it's my honor to be able to have some small role in helping move it forward. The Alliance consists of about 20 companies and organizations, and just about every law enforcement agency with an acronym, not only those represented on this panel, but many in the audience as well. Department of Justice, both criminal and national security divisions. As of last week, the National Security Division is participating. The FBI, HSI, IRS, U.S. Secret Service, the Marshal Service, the FDA, Office of Criminal Investigations, Europol, Interpol, and the California AG's office. So we're only 3 or 4 months into our work, but it's going well so far, and we think it's a real credit to the industry that this initiative has begun. So with that, let me go down the line and ask the panelists to introduce themselves.
My name is Marco Santori. I am the leader of the digital currency and blockchain technology team at Pillsbury Winthrop. It's a 26-lawyer team, an interdisciplinary team of attorneys from everywhere from intellectual property, patent and trademark work to tax and privacy and data security, and of course what I do, which is primarily regulatory and policy work. One of my clients who is a member of the Blockchain Alliance, who I'm here today to represent, is the aptly named, I think, blockchain.info. It's the world's largest digital currency wallet service, and we're happy to be a part of it today.
My name is Jerry Brito, and I'm the executive director of Coin Center. Coin Center is an independent nonprofit focused on the public policy issues affecting cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. We're based here in Washington, D.C., and we do 3 things, basically. We engage in education of policymakers specifically, also the media, but mostly policymakers. We want to make sure that as they consider regulation legislation that affects this technology, that they understand the technology and they don't do anything that might hamper the technology inadvertently. education is sort of like a big component of what we do. But more importantly, what we do is policy research. And what that means is that as we have conversations with policymakers, with folks on the Hill and state capitals around the country and with regulators at agencies, we identify areas where the technology has outpaced law, where there is now a gray area. There are gaps in the law because this technology is so unique. And we need to fill in those gaps. And so we develop the policy thinking to fill in those gaps. And that includes frameworks that help regulators think through what the law should be, as well as model legislation, model regulation that we propose. And our mission there is to make sure that regulators can meet their ends while preserving the freedom to innovate for developers and technologists. And then finally, we do advocacy, which means that we lobby on behalf of the solutions that we develop, and we do that here in DC and around the country. So part of that is participating with the Blockchain Alliance and helping putting it together, and we're thrilled with what it's done so far.
My name's Kevin Abar. I'm the Associate Deputy Assistant Director for Homeland Security Investigations. I oversee narcotics, special operations, and financial. And Bitcoin and blockchain is just a small part of what we do, but we're very fortunate to have industry actually come with us. And thank you, Jason, for mentioning that. It's very important that we work side by side with our partners. So this is a new time for us. We're excited to be part of it, and we look forward to working with you all.
Great. John Beccia, I'm General Counsel and Chief Compliance Officer for Circle Financial, based out of Boston. Been at this for a couple of years. Our company is really focused on the consumer payment space, and both in traditional currency as well as digital currency. I agree with Jason that my background is in banking, and seeing the level of coordination here with these groups has been really eye-opening. It wasn't always that way. When we first started, it seemed like there was a bunch of people running around and talking to different agencies, and now I think we're seeing a maturity of both the industry as well as a thinking in terms of law enforcement and regulators as far as centralizing these discussions. And I think it's really important. So look forward to the discussion this morning.
My name is Alden Pelker. I'm an analyst with the FBI's Money Laundering Intelligence Unit. My unit covers all of the different ways that the FBI's criminal targets move, conceal, and hide their funds, regardless of the form that those funds take. So my specialty is in new emerging payment systems, really anything that touches the fintech space. So Bitcoin has been a pretty predominant part of my job dating back to about 2011. And one of the great things about my job is that while it's very focused on the illicit use of virtual currencies, I also have a responsibility to educate the rest of the FBI and the entities that we work with on Bitcoin generally, some of the investigative challenges and opportunities dealing in different areas of the cryptocurrency space, which means that I've gotten to interact with the private companies in the space really dating back since the very early days of Bitcoin. It's been great to see the space evolve. We've forged some really solid partnerships with many of the private companies operating within this ecosystem, and are looking forward to both continuing those relationships and then forging new ones through the Alliance and elsewhere, and are really pleased to be here.
So I have to say, I've been on panels with just about everybody on this panel, and the Chamber really put together an extraordinary group of people. And this is a true story. This weekend I was trying to explain Bitcoin, the blockchain, to my mother-in-law, unsuccessfully. And after flailing about for about 10 minutes, I asked if I could use a phone a friend, and I was going to call any of these guys. Anybody old enough to understand that reference, phone a friend? And when I couldn't get any of them on the phone, we just moved back to a safer topic, which is my long list of shortcomings as a parent. So I'm going to bring the panel to my house the next time my in-laws are here and try again. So why don't we start, Alden, with where you left off in your introduction, which is the state of the relationship between law enforcement and industry. I'm sure there are a lot of people in the audience from who work for lawmakers and regulators who probably don't know how that relationship has evolved. And so why don't we go down the line and ask each of you to comment on where you think the state of the relationship is, how far it's come, and where you see it going forward.
I think It really, at least speaking generally, and certainly for those in this room, from a law enforcement perspective, it really is a very positive relationship. And it's grown and developed over the years of repeated interactions with a lot of the companies in the space. From the law enforcement side, we are dealing mostly with the exchanges, sometimes the wallet hosting providers, companies that have some sort of regulatory obligation here to actually collect information that we as law enforcement can go to with legal process and obtain more information, or companies that have some sort of responsibility to be monitoring for suspicious transactions, looking out for illicit use. Now, that's not to say that every company is perfect. We see the same way as we do in any other industry where you have some entities in the space that really are specifically designed for criminal activity. We have companies that take their compliance and regulatory obligations very, very seriously, and we have a whole spectrum in between. But one of the great things to have been able to witness and be a part of over the last few years is viewing more and more companies kind of evolve along the spectrum, growing closer and closer to what we'd consider kind of an ideal state, where they're really solid partners in trying to combat the illicit use of these cryptocurrencies.
John, let me ask you the same question.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think we've come a long way, a very positive direction. I've been very encouraged with the level of cooperation. I think for a company like Circle or others in this space, there are so many forums to be heard and to have conversations on these issues, whether it's within formal working groups. You look at, you can name about 100 of them, but it's things like we participate in the Bank Secrecy Act Advisory Group. There's working groups in Europe. There's working groups in the U.S. and beyond. Groups like FATF and others have invited us to speak. So there's definitely a lot of forums, and I think the biggest thing has been education, and that's two-way education. It's one, it's us as an industry trying to explain the technology, the background, and then the risks that we're seeing and how we're dealing with that and what we're doing. And we're maturing also in that space. So we've come a long way from early days in terms of being understand, okay, how is this different than traditional financial services, these unique risks, what controls do we need to put in place and think about things differently? Because at the end of the day, it does come down to being a risk-based program from a compliance perspective. I think definitely there's a lot of interaction on individual basis, so we see a lot of subpoenas, we get a lot of inbound requests, and we start to develop relationships with those individuals. We're able to turn around information really quickly, I think because of our systems and the level and the wealth of the information that we provide, whether it's responses to subpoenas, whether it's SARS, I think is quite useful. I think it's a bit of a different relationship, I think, too, from kind of regulators that we deal with who are a little more jaded, also have a different mission. They're examining you, they're in, looking at different things. I think here it seems a little bit more of a partnership. You're kind of on the same team, especially in these investigations. And so I think that has been really, really positive. Areas of improvement, Jason, you mentioned, I think it's just continuing to have those levels of communication. I think these working groups are good. I think, I'd like to see maybe some more individual kind of task force to like particular areas where it's, for example, like ransomware, or we see things popping up left and right, and really kind of tackle the issues associated with them. I think another big thing would be helpful for us as an industry is feedback. And so again, we see certain things on our platform. We have a certain customer base, but we don't see the big picture. So understanding what are the trends out there? Is there an alert? Are there things that we should be worried about? So that kind of two-way communication would be helpful. Suspicious activity reports, SARS, maybe some case studies, either particular to SARS we filed and how that was helpful to you, law enforcement, or just generally speaking, those type of things, I think would definitely be helpful. In terms of managing the relationship, I think a lot of us have already done this, but I think it's be helpful to have a central point of contact with different agencies. And so I give the agencies a lot of credit. I mean, everyone is very focused, getting up to speed very quickly. But there's a lot of field offices and a lot of requests from different parties at different agencies. And if there's some way we can funnel that to a central point of contact, I think that would be very helpful. It's interesting too. I'm learning a lot about these, how these agencies work, and it seems to be the most random places where you get requests from, and you say, "Wait a second, is that a legitimate law enforcement agency? FBI agent, and somewhere in the middle of Montana or New Mexico or something." But So that would be definitely helpful as well in terms of understanding and having that central point of contact and really getting that information to flow back and forth. But I think the process so far has been really, really quite effective.
Yeah, it's funny, when you spend a lot of time in government, you kind of forget that people outside of government can't keep all the acronyms straight. And one of the things I found is that the government agencies can't keep all the Bitcoin companies straight because they all have bit in the title and then some other word attached to it. Yeah. And so there's a lot of education back and forth just about who the requesters are and making sure they're, as you said, making sure they're legit.
One last point, sorry. One last thing I also want to mention is one helpful thing, too, would be perhaps somehow creating a centralized database of information. And so their queries, we're getting lists of like blacklisted addresses or Bitcoin addresses and just getting those thrown in us. And I'm sure other companies are just getting those as well. If there was some way to create some kind of central depository that could be queried, I know there's a lot of issues around that in terms of privacy, and we have to be careful about all those things. But somehow to make that process a little more centralized would be helpful. And that's kind of a topic that we can think about how that would work, but just throwing that out there.
Sure. Kevin, what's your observation about the relationship?
Well, just to clarify, the government agencies can't keep all the acronyms straight either, so I just want to make that clear. You bring up a couple good points, and that is education, partnership, and I think the biggest thing for us is really the relationship, that we've actually come about to have a trust working with the private industry. We reach out to many of the financial institutions and many of the private stakeholders across the board. And I think the key is having that understanding how the private industry works and how private industry works with law enforcement. And then having that trust where you can actually call us. We're getting a lot of calls on just trends, patterns, and anomalies. And we need the private industry to work side by side with us. It's been a great educational tool. As you say, it's the first time that private industry has really come into us without the government or law enforcement coming to you first. So we've had a great success. We're trying to centralize for some of the companies. Our field offices will reach out. We're trying to centralize that within the DC area, and we're trying to get agents out to the individual companies. It's very difficult with all the three-letter acronyms and who's who and who covers what. And it really is a whole government approach. We really have to work side by side, and I think it's a whole industry approach as well, working side by side with the federal government.
So, Jerry, you have kind of a unique perspective. You've been at this, as long as anybody, and you can see the whole field. How government perceives the companies and how the companies perceive the government agencies. What's your perspective on how that relationship has evolved?
I think it's come a long way. I'm an old hand like Alden, right? So if you think about 2011, in 2011, we didn't have guidance from FinCEN about whether, as an industry, as a player in the industry, you were regulated or what you had to do, how could you comply? And at that time, the industry was very immature. And even after you had the guidance and you understood, or you should have understood what you needed to do, a lot of the actors in the industry were not very mature and weren't compliant. I think we've come a very long way where today you have a mature industry that understands what compliance means and has great help from general counsels to outside counsels, getting them there. And the relationship with law enforcement, I think, as a result, has been strengthened. And the reason that's so important from my perspective, apart from the fact that this is good for everybody, it's that when you have a ransomware issue, you have a member of Congress who has a constituent, calls them and says, I've been attacked with ransomware. Now this begins to color this member of Congress's perception of this technology. And when you go to they call you, your coin center, it's a Bitcoin question, they call you, and you go in there to talk to them about it, it's important to say, we're working with law enforcement. And folks on the Hill, policymakers, they always reach out to law enforcement, and they say, do you have the tools that you need? And it's important for law enforcement to always say to the policymakers, yes, we have those tools, and industry is doing a good job. And so I think this is where we are today, and we just need to keep working to keep it going.
So, Marco, you wear multiple hats. You've got your Pillsbury hat where you represent a lot of different companies, including a bunch of the ones in this room, and you've got your blockchain hat. What's your perspective on how the relationship has changed and where you see it going in the future?
By and large, I agree with the panelists. I think that this has been a tremendously positive, this has had a tremendously positive effect on the industry. It's had a great effect. I know in the individual relationships between outside counsel, general counsel, compliance counsel, and law enforcement. One of the greatest benefits of this is the time saving. Whether or not this ends up getting law enforcement more information or protecting more of the rights of the startups and the financial institutions in the space, I think that truly has yet to be seen. I think that the greatest benefit of this is the cost and time savings that's happened, and this has been a tremendously streamlined forum for being able to communicate to law enforcement on behalf of my clients. Look, this is what we don't have. You can send a subpoena, you can do an MLAT, you can do whatever you want to do, but it's just, you're not going to get blood from a stone, and that saves a lot of time. But this is the information that we do have, and this is how to get it. This is who to send, this is where to get your court order entered. This is who to send it to. We'll accept service. Give us a heads up. And we'll start compiling the information before the subpoena is served on us or the court order is served on us, and then we'll provide it as soon as we have the court order. That's one of the processes that we take in a lot of circumstances. And I think that there's been a tremendous savings in time and cost on both sides there. That said, I promised I'd stir the pot, and I promised I'd flip some tables. I think that there's something of an uneven understanding of why different companies are involved in this space. Some companies are involved in this space because they think they have to be. They're involved in the blockchain alliance because they think that if they're not, well, they're going to get branded. This is not a secret. This is just something a lot of people don't like to talk about, but it's true. That's why some companies are involved. Other companies, and I have to say, by and large, most companies are involved in the blockchain alliance, in my experience, because they genuinely want to help, because they're not in the business of creating an environment that's suitable for criminal activity, and they want to do everything they can, constrained by some of the other forces on them, like their constituencies, like the laws. Whatever they can to help. And the same thing on the law enforcement side. I think there's a lot of people from law enforcement that think that because a company is part of the blockchain initiative, they're going to get information that they wouldn't otherwise be permitted to get. And that is frustrating for a lot of companies.
Yeah.
At the same time, I think that the tremendous value here has been between law enforcement and companies, where law enforcement where the companies can help law enforcement to understand the best ways to get what they need. And that's sort of been my experience. It's somewhat uneven, but at the same time, this is something that must be done. I think this is a net positive.
As you know, one of the things that we try very hard to do is to make sure that privacy is not sacrificed at the altar of cooperation with law enforcement, and that the conversations are not about particular targets or investigations or particular customers. But one of the things that I've been surprised by is how there was a need on both sides to improve the process. You mentioned the cost savings of having the process of getting law enforcement requests fulfilled more quickly is a time savings for everybody. It's time savings for the government too. I've been pleasantly surprised at how many good ideas people had on both sides about how to improve that process without sacrificing the legal protections that customers deserve.
Yeah, I think that I think that the compliance procedures and policies of so many companies have developed so haphazardly, and they haven't been developed with comment and cooperation with law enforcement. And that's something that you've been doing a great job of, and that as an organization, it's probably going to be one of the best things to come out of this in the near term, is this sort of standardized means of communication and helping each other, by whether it means, to make this specific, whether it means setting up a central database like we were talking about earlier, or developing a real sort of guide for law enforcement on each company's website that says, this is what we have, this is what we don't have, this is the best way to get what you need.
So let me ask this question to Alden and to Kevin. If you're a lawmaker, you work for a lawmaker, and you read in the newspaper about Silk Road and about the agents from the Silk Road case who themselves were prosecuted, and you read about ransomware, and extortion cases, Ashley Madison extortions involving Bitcoin, which we'll talk about a little more in a bit. And so your knowledge of Bitcoin is primarily derived from criminal cases involving Bitcoin. I thought it'd be useful for you all to have an opportunity to talk about, based on the investigations you've done so far, those that have resulted in prosecutions and those that maybe have not gone the distance and not been successful, what are the lessons you have learned about the challenges of investigating crime involving Bitcoin and the blockchain, and where do you see opportunities that the Bitcoin and the blockchain present? So I'll let you flip a coin.
Kind of to break out, I think you brought up two issues. So the first is this public perception.
You objecting to the form of my question?
Compound question. So the first is the idea that a lot of people's first introduction to Bitcoin is negative. And that's true for a lot of our agents too, because the first time you come across it is when you see it come up in a case. And for a lot of the victims of the crimes, the first experience that they're going to have with Bitcoin is going to be a ransomware demand. And as within the FBI, the Department of Justice, and the government as a whole, we've really tried to bring home this message repeatedly in all of our public statements. There's nothing inherently illicit about using Bitcoin. We've included that now in numerous indictments, in public statements. Really, law enforcement's focus, simply by virtue of being law enforcement, is investigation of the illicit use. But we recognize that there's a large environment out there. And we do try to make sure to incorporate that message whenever we do get requests, whether it's from victims, from the Hill, and make sure that everyone understands that we do appreciate that. We only are really focused on a small subsection of the Bitcoin ecosystem, but we do have an appreciation of everything else that's going on there. And it feeds in both our understanding and then also the opportunities that we have in looking at investigating these types of illicit activity. Because really, the more legitimate activity that is going on, the more we have very legitimate law-abiding companies operating in the space, the more opportunities we're going to have to actually succeed in our investigations. Jason, you mentioned the second half of your question of the actual blockchain analytics, how we use information related to blockchain and Bitcoin actually to further our investigations. And really, the companies in the space are the biggest part of that. So we've had now numerous public investigations where we do use the blockchain as a method to track transactions from victims over to criminals, from criminals to other criminal associates, from an unknown, unidentified criminal out to an exchange that we can go to with legal process and actually get real-world identifying information. That's what ultimately leads to the arrest, where we might not otherwise have known who the real, actual individual was behind that address. And we've had successes there. It's not easy. We don't succeed all of the time. But it's impossible if the companies in the space aren't collecting the information that they're required to, aren't receptive to legal process. But what we've seen is that in most of the instances where we are able to successfully track the information out, the companies have been great partners. There's a lot of area for improvement. Marco mentioned there's a lot of room to evolve and grow compliance programs. Some, I think you used the term haphazard. I think a lot of the companies they're very well intentioned. It's always tough in a new industry to figure out what an effective anti-money laundering program and compliance program looks like. It's not unique to the blockchain space, but we're seeing it come to the fruition kind of very poignantly in this space right now. But the success there on the company side is really what feeds the law enforcement success in investigating these types of crimes and using the blockchain as an opportunity to further investigations, not just as a hindrance.
Okay.
Well, as criminal investigators, we look at things for the use of illicit means. When we start looking at blockchain, we start looking at Bitcoin, one of the things that we realized very early on was that we needed a partnership. We need to understand that technology. It was very scary at first, just like the internet when it first came out. We weren't sure how law enforcement was going to address those issues. We're very competent now, working with the internet, working with our partners there. And so when we start looking at those investigations, we realize that, you know what, this is still a crime of perhaps sex tourism, perhaps narcotics, but they're just using a different means of payment. And that's what we had to look at. Then we had to look at the laws that were in place, perhaps the 1960 laws of money service business or money laundering laws, and how do they now fit in to that cryptocurrency. And I think we've done a very, very good job. And again, it goes back to the partnerships that we have with industry. Now we actually had someone we could go to and say, how does this work? As special agents, we understand how it used to work, funnel accounts, moving money through money service businesses, but now we have a new way of moving value. And I think that was the key of trying to understand how is that value moved and how is it used for illicit means. And then we came almost full circle, realizing that, you know what, perhaps the blockchain, perhaps Bitcoin and the virtual currencies aren't bad. They actually do have a legitimate means. And with that blockchain and with the tools and working with our partners in industry, we actually have a good investigative tool to move forward. We can actually use that technology now that we understand it. And the key was understanding it not only from a law enforcement perspective, but also from a private industry perspective of how it's being used.
So, as you both know from investigating cybercrime, cyber criminals are constantly evolving in their tactics, constantly coming up with new ways to anonymize themselves or certainly try to anonymize themselves or make it harder for you to figure out who they really are. As you move forward into this kind of second phase of investigations on the blockchain, what are the threats you're most worried about? What are the things that keep you up at night to the extent you're losing sleep over this?
I think loss of our ability to effectively trace the payments. At this point, as long as we can trace transactions through the blockchain and tie it back to some real-world identity at some point, you kind of go back hop by hop. Sometimes we end up hitting a dead end, but usually you can actually find some company there that's regulated in the space that's collecting information. But as he mentioned, our criminals are, and it's not even just cyber criminals now, we've seen kind of all different types of underlying violations now turning to Bitcoin for transactions. And they've gotten much more sophisticated in how they're using the blockchain. They're not just going from one address, a couple hops to an exchange. They're getting much more sophisticated and making it much harder for us to track transactions, which ends up making our jobs much more difficult.
I think some of the concerns for our agency is actually the peer-to-peer exchangers, the individuals outside the legal system that are exchanging fiat currency for those coins. That's a huge challenge that we have. The other challenge that we have is really just regulation, not only here within the United States, but also abroad. Various countries view virtual currency differently. Some of them ignore it altogether. So it's how do we bring this together? Because virtual currency, it doesn't just have one border. It goes across the country, across the world, and how do we deal with that? And I think we've done a good job within law enforcement through DOJ and Department of Homeland Security of reaching out to our counterparts overseas and working side by side with them. But as this develops, I think laws need to be developed across international boundary lines to really address the issues.
So let me ask our industry folks the same question I asked these guys. What keeps you up at night as you confront the challenge of compliance in your companies? John?
Yeah, so I think it all comes down to the level of risks and the risks that we deal with on a daily basis. Certainly the risk profile for a company like us is different than a financial services company because of the nature of the products that we're dealing with. And so, we have customers coming in from countries all over the world. They can move money very quickly. They're coming in online. It's basically a mobile application. They sign up, you're off and running. You're able to exchange your traditional currency for digital currency, and you can move money very quickly. The product itself, you look at the risks. There are gaps in terms of counterparties, being able to see counterparties within transactions and things like that. And so I think about those risks, and then we think about from a compliance program, how do we address that? And I think you have to be a little more creative in terms of your KYC or knowing your customer, and not only collecting traditional CIP or customer information, but also looking behind, utilizing the technology and looking at the data points that you have, whether it's where the geolocations, the IP addresses, all those technology points, the behavior of the customer, and creating systems to help with that. I think the blockchain forensic tools are really effective in terms of being able to follow the money, being able to track transactions. Again, I think it's important that we have a regulated industry and that exchanges are regulated in terms of, I think it's helpful that you're having SARS filed to law enforcement and you can connect the dots. And so you have companies like us that are doing the KYC who know our customers, combine that with the being able to follow transactions over the blockchain, which I think is an effective combination for sure. The other thing that keeps you up at night, as you mentioned briefly, is the external regulatory environment. I think, things have settled a little pretty much in the U.S. FinCEN really began this in 2013. I think we have to also, as a money transmitter, we have to deal with the majority of the U.S. states. But you also do have some regulatory arbitrage, as Kevin mentioned. There is other countries that look at this very differently. You have now a kind of a reaction or maybe an overreaction in Europe to things like the Paris attacks. So the EU Commission is looking at what they can do here. And I think it goes back to, okay, let's just make sure that everyone's educated to understand that regulation, I think a certain level of regulation is important, but it needs to be measured. It needs to allow the technology to evolve, and it needs to really, it should be risk-based, just like the compliance program. It should focus on what are the major risk areas for these types of industries. The other couple of things that keep me up is making sure, managing and working with our banking partner, because companies like us do need banks to facilitate these transactions. So, and there's still not a lot of banks that are operating in this space, and so they are doing a really deep dive when it comes in terms of diligence at the front end, and then ongoing relationship. And so we really manage that relationship. It's almost similar to having another examiner with you, or a regulator overseeing you, and so that's very important. And but if you do things the right way, you have a solid compliance program. That shouldn't be an issue. And then the final thing is just managing internally and making sure that you have a culture of compliance within your organization, making sure that compliance is at the table for all major policy decisions, product decisions. As these guys know, technology, this stuff moves really rapid, breakneck speed, and so you have to be able to make decisions on a very quickly and really incorporate it into your overall program to make sure there's no gaps from that standpoint.
Marco, how about you, from your perspective?
So the companies that I represent are typically international companies. They operate internationally. There's the rare exception of the hyper-local business, like the exchange kiosk or something like that. But most companies in this space, including my own client base, has to deal internationally. And there really are conflicts of laws. It's a topic that we talk about kind of flippantly, but it prevents these companies from doing what they want to do. Most of the time, it really circumscribes the kind of business that they can engage in. And it circumscribes the kind of help that they can provide to law enforcement, which is frustrating. But I think that because of this international presence of these companies, I think there's an amplified risk of legislators and policymakers getting it wrong, and that's what keeps me up at night. That's truly what keeps me up at night. It's not an enforcement. It's not an enforcement question. It's a policy-making question. And there's no doubt in my mind that this technology will be the career-defining technology for an entire generation of legal beagles, of folks in policy, folks in enforcement, folks who are outside counsel, inside counsel. And for a lot of these folks, myself included, we have never had to deal with something this complex. Folks who have been around, who have more gray hairs on their head than I do, have never had to deal with something this complex. Not just technologically, but from a policy perspective, this turns so many axioms on their heads. The concept of regulating intermediaries, for example. I think we all know that in a few years that's just not going to cut it anymore, because look, we identified one of the greatest risks here is the peer-to-peer nature of this, and right now policy both in the U.S. and abroad is to regulate intermediaries, regulate custodians, because we want to prevent anti-money laundering. We want to control for prudential risks. But when you can't achieve those policy goals anymore by doing what you've done for the last 30 years, what comes next? How do you craft new policy to do this right? And what happens to the companies that are caught in the crossfire there? This is really going to be a career-defining event for, I think anybody in this room who's dedicated their career to it, certainly.
So, one of the things that I found interesting we've had 4 or 5 of our regular Blockchain Alliance virtual meetings, and after the first couple of them, I lost count of the number of law enforcement people or regulators who called just to make the observation that they were surprised to hear, this goes to John's point about a culture of compliance, how serious the companies were about compliance, that the companies are run by grown-ups and that they have lawyers and they've got people with financial services backgrounds. And so let me start with Jerry, and I'll ask Marco and John as well. What do you think is the thing that you would most want if you're sitting in a room? You're often sitting in a room with lawmakers and their staffs, but if you were sitting in one populated entirely by that audience today, what's the thing you think, the misconception of the industry that you think most needs to be corrected?
Well, I don't know if it's a misconception of the industry per se, but it's about the technology. And it kind of goes to what Marco was saying. It is a peer-to-peer technology, and it is decentralized. And so you have to understand what are the limitations that you're facing that are new. And these are limitations that are not going to go away as much as you'd like them to. I mean, we were talking about what keeps you up at night. What keeps me, I think we're getting the hook. If I can just finish and say that what keeps me up at night is, look, the Paris attack had no connection to digital currencies, but you can imagine that it would have. And the overreaction there that would have been inevitable would have led to clamping down on these intermediaries in a way that would make Alden's job more difficult. Because if these intermediaries can't comply, or if the law is so tough that the intermediaries can't comply with it, then they can't collect data to give to Alden. And then we do move to that peer-to-peer world, and then we're all left with nothing.
So what keeps me up at night is going over time.
Yeah.
Because the first rule of being a moderator is don't keep people from their food. But we do have a question.
Is this on? Jerry, I think you actually got to my question. Yaya Fanusi, think tank in D.C. at Foundation for Defense of Democracies. I work for we have a center on sanctions and illicit finance. Question is, it's great. I'm former government now, not working in government, but I've been in the national security sector. It's great to see all sides, everyone cordial, talking, alliances. This is wonderful. But we're all watching Apple versus FBI. So I have the question which you're sort of getting into. Can you guys imagine, and can all of you imagine a scenario where we have an Apple v. FBI versus FBI sort of situation? And maybe you've sort of alluded to it, but what would that look like? And are you guys maybe preventing that by getting ahead of it now?
Absolutely. And I hope it doesn't happen, but look, you can imagine, it's going to be more difficult because it is peer-to-peer and it is decentralized, but you can imagine a world where the overreaction to a Paris-type attack that's financed with digital currency is that the government would want something like Bitcoin or similar cryptocurrency, that any cryptocurrency would have to have built into its code, anti-money laundering checks. And so how do you do that? Well, you have to go to developers and require them to write certain code, which to me is compelled speech, which would not be allowed under the First Amendment. And that's being tested right now in the Apple case. So I'm keeping a close eye on that.
I think that this issue is not coming to a head. It is very much at a head today, right now, and I can give an anecdote that might put some color on that. We have, as part of the Blockchain Alliance, we have law enforcement coming to us saying, one particular example. Law enforcement comes to me and they say, we need this information. We think you have it. I say, yeah, in fact, we probably do have that information, but we probably will need a subpoena for something like that. We'll accept service, we'll make it easy. They say, yeah, but this is why that's really not going to work, and this is why we think we really need your help on this, in this very circumstance. It is a righteous case. This is why we don't think those laws should prevent you from providing that information. Can you help us out? My reaction is, well, this is a righteous situation. If the company has the option of doing it, they should do it. They should help law enforcement. It looks like the law probably doesn't prohibit this. And I go to my CEOs, I go to my clients, and I say, this is what I think we should do. My client looks at me and they say, are you crazy? Are you crazy? You're advising me to put myself in the very same position that Apple is in today, where Apple has helped law enforcement in the past, or at least this is the law enforcement allegations, and they put these allegations in their papers in court, and they say in their brief, you can read one of the footnotes in the most recent filing, where the government says, Apple has helped us in the past. It's not that they can't help us, it's that they've just changed their mind. And so now my clients are looking at me and saying, you want to put us in that position? You're crazy. And that's a real challenge, especially when there are, to use the word of one of the particular government agents that spoke to me, especially when there are righteous cases, when we should be doing that, when we should be helping law enforcement. There's no easy answer to this. It's nobody's fault. It's just, this is the climate in which we have to make these decisions. These are tough decisions.
So I'm sorry we don't have more time for questions from the audience, although I think most of the panelists will be around for some time today, and we'd love to chat with you more, but I think we're getting